Good afternoon and good evening, rugby community. I know in the past few webinars we have had people from across the globe interested in joining some of our webinars. A man from France messaged me today saying he wished he could stay awake to hear Calum Ramsay speak, but he will be joining us next week for one of our next topics. In the meantime, Rugby Canada would like to thank you all for attending. Once again, this is our 5th installment, I believe, or 6th of the Rugby Canada webinar series. Tonight, we are kindly joined by Calum Ramsay. He is the senior men's sevens video analyst, and analyst, period. Video is just one of the methods he uses, and he's been kind enough to take some time out of his day to join us to go over some of the principles that he uses when looking at the game of rugby and how analysis can be used to obviously help your team improve. So just a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you who are new to the GoToWebinar control feature, you should have a chat or question box. If you could please put your questions through there. What I will do is over the course of Calum's presentation, moderate to kind of combine questions where we have themes that are similar. And then Calum will obviously try and touch on as many different topics as he can. If anyone has any technical difficulties, put them in the question box as well, and I will try and get to those. We've had a number of requests to put the webinars up online. They have all been recorded. We are working on how we post these webinars and what content needs to be shared and what maybe cannot be shared, and all those kinds of technical pieces that we still need to sort out. So as we get that finalized, we will be messaging through our social media and our website to let people know how they can access that content. In the meantime, Calum, thank you once again for joining us. If you don't mind, maybe just giving us any additional information outside of what your role is as an introduction, and then take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the intro, Nathan. Super pleased to see a bunch of people dial in for this. My intention in having this talk was to keep like a really broad scope, so truly speak to principles of analysis and avoid more of the actual technical, this is how you code a game, this is the exact numbers that you need, or anything along those lines. At least in the first 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to keep to like a really high kind of satellite view of my mindset and my approach to how I work with the game. In terms of background on myself, I played rugby for 10 years, Ontario kid, moved out west, have been doing performance analysis now with Rugby Canada for 10 years. More recently, I've switched over to exclusively working with the men's sevens. So I just want to forewarn everybody, if I am saying guys or men or anything like that, it's just habit, nothing personal against junior rugby or women's rugby, anything like that. And just it's really embedded in my vernacular, and I'm going to do my best to speak to players and athletes, stuff like that. I've been to the 11 and 15 World Cups in the 15 side of the game. 15s haven't been involved since the last repechage and the ARC leading into that. So maybe a little more catering to sevens and some of the stuff that I say here. And at the same time, I really like, there's a guy I listen to on YouTube all the time named Alan Watts, really like his idea of if I approach somebody in a conversation with a really well-rounded sense of a topic that, you know, if my perspective is here and your perspective is here and we talk, nothing really changes. So I'm actually going to do my best to really come in with a bit of a different perspective on a couple of things. I might say a few things that seem like really out there, and my intention in that is to actually kind of broaden the breadth of what we have available to us in terms of tools of how we look at rugby, and maybe challenge some existing viewpoints on how attendees are looking at the game. So from there, I'm going to jump right into it. There's going to be a number of things also that I speak to that I won't actually explain a whole lot just given the limited amount of time that we have. So fully encourage you to take as many notes as you can. Please challenge me in the question and answer stuff afterwards. I'd love to actually grow my own understanding and my own perspective on the game. And is there anything else I wanted to say? Yeah, if something comes up, I'll talk about things like degree of desirable difficulty or the Ebbinghaus curve and stuff like that. Just make a note and have a look to get a little bit of depth of knowledge for yourself there, so that you'll get filled in terms of what I'm talking about as we move through this. So without any further ado, start with why is one of Simon Sinek's TED Talks. And so start this off with why people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So performance analysis, like why should you care? And essentially for me, it's this idea of can I? So constant never-ending improvement. Hugely untapped resource still within the game of rugby is that our physical training can only last for a limited amount of time. And working with the brain, working to, again, get a better understanding of how an individual works, how an individual thinks, how a decision gets made in game, that can all be done. This idea of training the brain can all be done through performance analysis. So this growth mindset, like always looking to make improvements. And I will also say that within making improvements, it doesn't always have to be about doing more and more and more. Sometimes there can be growth mindset in actually saying, hey, we've done enough. I'm going to give myself permission to unplug now. So that's something I will speak to in a little bit. In terms of training the brain, and again, my background is mechanical engineering. I don't have a huge background in teaching, but I was really fortunate to live with a cognitive scientist in Victoria for the first 5 or 6 years that I lived here. And so the two of us, he had a great palate for craft beer, and two of us would sit there and drink a tasty local beer at the end of a hard work day and just talk all about the way that memory works, the way that learning works. So a lot of this, as much as I would love to say that it was stuff that I've come up with, is due to this man, Mario Baldassari, who's now a professor down in Texas. So one of the key things that he introduced me to is this idea of when we educate people, when we train their brains through performance analysis, there's two components of the education. The first is that we have to educate people in a way that they learn something new. The thing is, once they learn something new, they also have to retain it. And I love this quote, again, another TED Talk from this neuroscientist named Jamshed Bharucha. The dirty secret about learning is that we forget. So what does all of that look like in terms of education, training the brain within rugby? I've got essentially 3 themes and 3 pillars in terms of performance analysis. The first is accessibility. So with whatever information that I have, I'm looking to make it super accessible to as many people as possible. So in this case, it can start by being ease of access from wherever a player is, whether they're in the training environment, on a plane, at home, making, pre-training, post-training, anything like that. So for us, we use a number of different softwares. Sports Code is that blue S logo, so that's our sort of main workhorse in terms of how we break games down, come up with data sets, tease little bits of valuable information out of that data set. Game Plan is the G in red on the bottom left there, and that's like a review platform that we use where everything goes out to players on their phones. So games, training sessions, preview packages, personal notes, any little homework assignments they might have on the side. It's all super accessible to them, generally on their mobile device. Now, again, you can spend a lot of money in software in analysis very easily. And also, if you're approaching this from a club mindset, there is absolutely nothing wrong with YouTube, Facebook, private Facebook groups, WhatsApp, like being able to find a way to make information accessible all the time, or sort of just with a tap of a couple of keys to your target group is massively important. The other thing is this idea of learning styles, in that background in engineering for me, I can talk numbers till the cows come home. But unless I can actually convey my information in a way that is relevant and meaningful to the coaches that I'm working with, to the players that I'm working with, maybe to a strength conditioning or a medical staff member, it's just not actually going to be of use to whoever my target audience person is. So one of the things I have down there is this, a note on learning styles. I will look to put information out. We'll have conversations with people if they're auditory learners or if they're tactile learners, okay, so what do you actually, from what we've talked about, what do you actually need to go do to really embed that knowledge to make sure that you've retained it? We can send out handouts, PDFs, anything like that. One of the important things, the reason I have that note up, a note on learning styles, is I have a really strong belief that we have a really important job to do here in sport, especially on the national team, and helping guys achieve at a high level and perform, the best that they can on the field. And also we have a responsibility to them that if we're only ever catering to a single learning style or a single way of learning, we're really not developing them as people. So sometimes there is going to be a little bit of a challenge in getting people to pick up new ways of learning, challenging them to get out of their comfort zone and stretch and find a way of discovering something new, taking on a new practice habit, anything like that. It's going to broaden their ability to take on information from multiple different angles, multiple different aspects, not just for the sake of when they're in the rugby environment, but outside of the rugby environment, maybe when they're at work, when they're at school, and post-rugby, whatever comes next for them, being able to actually move with whatever's coming in and process different types of information. Just sticking to a single learning style because that's what a guy knows and that's what he's good with, I don't actually believe is of service. So accessibility from an information perspective, super important. Next kind of theme is that any analysis information that we have, it has to be actionable. Again, I can deliver hundreds of pages of reports to my head coach and give him all kinds of information, but unless it's really about something that we can take from a pile of information and then implement in a training environment. So in this case, protocols. I'm not really ever a huge proponent of rules because rugby is a dynamic game. Things change. You get different snapshots at a different breakdown or in a kickoff contest or whatever it may be. But having a protocol, having a general framework from the analysis work that we've done of, okay, as an example, maybe if you see the first line of kickoff receivers backing up, that means that we're not, as the kicking team, going to go and contest that kick. Maybe we're just going to go to make a ball and all hit. Something like that would be an example of a protocol where there's a cue that we receive and then there's an action that we can take in response to that. Along with that, it's analysis. We have to find ways to measure whatever it is that we're looking at. And one of the best and worst parts of analysis, and the area that analysts will consistently bump up against their coaches and their players with, is that in order to make a measurement, we essentially have to put certain actions into a box. So this is a made tackle, this is a missed tackle. And what it might not take into account is, well, this is a missed tackle, but it wasn't your man. Or this is a made tackle, but you are tracking backwards at a high pace, and it gave them a quick ruck. So there is, as much as there is a benefit to analysis, there's also, we have to have the awareness that as soon as we constrain something in a box, no matter how much detail we go into, there's still going to have to be a judgment call there that is going to take a little bit of context out of that measurement. That said, once we have measurements, again, background in engineering, a lot of the courses that I used to take were involving feedback loops. So if we're going to measure something, what's the actual feedback that we're taking from it and that we're then going to relay forward? Again, if I put a 40-page report on your table, it's still very convoluted information. I would much rather give you a single page of very highly relevant, useful information that can then be fed into protocols, is then accessible to our athletes or to our coaches so that we can change the way we're making a decision or maybe tweak certain ways of looking at the game. And the last theme is that I'm a huge fan of simplicity. And I don't mean simplicity just, oh, I haven't done the work and we're going to just get something out there as fast as possible. I really look to make things simple, the other side of complexity. And that is probably a term worth Googling at some point down the road. The quickest way I can really speak to that is if you've ever gone to a really fancy restaurant. This is a screenshot from a place called Nourish, just down the road in Victoria. Really nice restaurant. You walk in and you've got, I think that's 9 menu items. And the thing is with this restaurant, they haven't just said, oh, we're going to take 9 random menu items and that's going to be that. They've likely gone through a process of assembling a massive amount of menu items, a massive number of plays or players, or of mindsets or of tactics. And then they've stripped away again and again what isn't of use to them. And essentially they've gotten to a point where with this menu of 9 items, they're saying you can set up a restaurant right next to us and we're still going to stay in business. We're still going to thrive because we do these 9 things really well. A really good example of this is Fiji on the Sevens World Series. You know that they're going to kick off and they're going to contest those kicks, get balls back, and get funny bounces and offloads, unconventional offloads, not necessarily 2 hands on the ball, eye contact with the receiver and move it. It's going to be some sort of Harlem Globetrotter stuff. And it's not that what they do is easy. It's actually quite simple in some ways of thinking about the game. They continually keep play flowing. They do it to such a high degree of expertise that it's almost impossible to stop when they're on a roll. So this idea, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was a guy who's an author and an adventurer many years ago, had this idea of simplicity is not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away. So again, whether it's a playbook that's 50 items long or a report on a game that has 500 pages or 300 information points, I really strive to constantly refine and actually take plays away, take information away if it's really not going to be of service to what we're trying to create in terms of an on-field performance. So those are the 3 themes. In terms of the actual pillars of like, what does that really look like? Active learning is massive. And the word that I continually go back to is this idea of like having a trim tab. So being a little, having these little behaviors that move make enormous movements within the sort of the team dynamic that you have. So the trim tab is this tiny little component within the rudder of ocean liners, of cruise ships, of oil tankers. And this trim tab is the thing that moves the rudder. So how do we get these tiny little bits of information that are actually going to make massive movements? Active learning is a massive part of this. So starting things starting things off in this conversation, I referred to the degree of desirable difficulty. And one of the reasons that I haven't necessarily dived right into really high-level description of some of the things I've talked to is because there's research in cognitive science that says if I just give you everything on a plate, you may not actually rise to the level of performance, like a very high level of performance. Introducing a slightly difficult approach to something, having people giving information to players, actually letting them digest it, asking leading questions, seeing what they see, and actually including them in conversation is absolutely massive, and allowing that little bit of struggle, that little bit of discomfort to take place in order to really build like robust understanding of games, robust understanding of information packages is massive. So again, always asking questions, having things being rebased. So another common thing that happens in preview time is we can say, okay, we're playing Argentina and they do this and they do this and they do this. And it's not really great information in the way of how I look at the game, because we know that Argentina is going to run a blitz defense. And okay, that's part one of the information. But when I say we base there, it's okay, Argentina does that. What do we do? So always having that mentality, bringing it back to us of like, how does this affect us? And if it doesn't affect us, then okay, Argentina has 14.4 offloads a game. If there's nothing we based about that, it's not going to be really fundamentally useful information. And again, within that, having player-led groups or player-led analysis, anything like that, perhaps on each team you have a ruck donkey, and you have one guy and his entire, one athlete, and his entire responsibility is to look at the breakdown of every single game. And that athlete becomes the expert, so that in game, as things are going one way or another, that person can be the expert on one particular aspect of play, and having another aspect of play covered by another player, so that the reliance of finding the right piece of information isn't all placed on a single player or on a head coach. Actually bringing like shared resources, collective knowledge, like pooling things in a way that the information workload is spread through players, coaches, support staff. Massively important in active learning and analysis. Spaced repetition also becomes really important in something else I referred to earlier, which is the Ebbinghaus curve. So another thing to Google is this idea of the forgetting curve. I don't have the numbers quite flat, but essentially, going back to that quote that we talked about with the dirty little secret of learning is that people forget. What we're talking through right now, in about half an hour to an hour, you'll have forgotten 50% of it. And in a day, you'll have forgotten 90% of it. And so when we have what is modeled by this forgetting curve is when we first learn something, we have a very high understanding of it, and that rapidly drops off. And then when we relearn it, the information, the understanding of it, the retention of it drops off a bit slower. And then we relearn it and it drops off a bit slower. And we relearn it and it drops off a bit slower. So by having spaced repetition analysis, that can be things like quotas. So if we're really deep into the season, just making sure that we have 15 lineouts every 3 days. And it doesn't matter if it's all in one day or 5 a day or how the spread looks, but actually making sure that each of these little aspects of play, that it's really important that we keep that retention rate high, that the forgetting curve doesn't drop off too much, just that we're constantly touching on these little things. Tiered information, I'm really big on from the perspective of just, again, taking away information that isn't going to be of use in game. If, for example, at the start of a test week, we might actually have a huge amount of information, and just constantly whittling away at what is being made available, what we're seeing as crucial, so that by the end, when we get to the business end of a test week, or as we get into a tournament for the seven side, whether it's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Saturday, Sunday, we just know that realistically, we've just got a few key pieces of information that we want to keep our heads wrapped around. And going back to the trim tab, with those key pieces of information, those are the pieces that are really going to see us come out with a positive result in the game. So that's this idea of spaced repetition. And lastly, deliberate practice, which, if anything, not really knowing exactly who the audience is made up of at this point, my guess is that there's going to be a lot of people from the club environments, and deliberate practice is probably if there's one thing that you're going to take out of this talk, I really hope that it would be something around deliberate practice. If deliberate practice doesn't work for you, there's this idea of game realism. What I mean by that, anybody who's read Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 Hours might be familiar with the concept of actually putting our athletes in a position so that they're challenged in training the same way that they are challenged in a game. So if you're the sort of coach, you're the sort of player that likes to have 50 left-handed passes 5 meters away in a row, that's really, there's a difference between so blocking and interleaving is also something that might be worth having a Google about once we're done in this talk. When we're learning a new skill, it's really important to just get really high repetition of something. And then once we get to a point of wanting to perform at a really high level, well, in a game, we're not going to get 50 left-handed passes. We're going to get one, and it's probably going to be under physical duress. So maybe running fitness interspersed with one or two passes, just to be able to really replicate the game environment while we're training. I think this is probably the area of analysis that most club environments are going to get the most out of with analysis for reasons I can get into a little bit later if that comes up through the questions. But finding ways in whatever information that we're taking out of analysis, we're then reintroducing it into the training environment with interventions that are game realistic. And if hopefully you have the environment with your athletes that you can actually have the conversation of, is the stuff that we're doing in training similar to what we do in games? Because if there's a lot of divergence between the training environment and a game, there's huge gains to be made by actually bridging that gap. So yeah, from a club perspective, really understanding, getting your head wrapped around what a game really entails. You know, growing up playing club rugby, a lot of Thursday training sessions would be 10 scrums that would each run 10 phases, then 10 lineouts that would each run 10 phases, then 10 restarts that would each run 10 phases. Well, not exactly how a game's run. Sometimes it's a scrum and then 3 phases, a restart and then 10 phases. Maybe not. I can't really speak to the state of the club game, but probably the biggest takeaway one of the quickest takeaways that could happen from a development standpoint when it comes to analysis is really getting a solid concept of what happens in a game and then taking that over into the training environment. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go full contact every training environment, but understanding what happens when games are make and break, what happens when games fall apart, what are the key events that happen either immediately before or immediately after a try to either shut down momentum of a try being scored on you or to score a try. And then once that event has happened, to sort of maintain momentum or take it away from the opposition. So that's deliberate practice. So again, staying true to the idea of the forgetting curve, we just covered a whole load of information. So let's get a second shot at relearning it. Why do this? This is all part of the constant never-ending improvement. Being able to train the brain, train our minds using analysis, using information is going to help us on the field when it finally comes time to perform. How do we do that? Make sure that we're actually educating our players for retention of information, not just so that they learn it. There's been a number of times where I've heard people say, you know, I've told 10 players 10 times this message. It's like, okay, so they might have learned it, but they might not have retained it. Maybe those 10 times need to be spaced out more. Maybe the message itself needs to be altered, so it's not simply being delivered to a player. Here's the answer. If they blitz, here's what you're going to do. Actually making it difficult in training, sometimes hitting a blitz defense, sometimes hitting a slide defense, and then having them adapt. That's part of, again, that degree of desirable difficulty that we talked about. And then what does that actually look like? That's that 3 and 3 graph there. So again, accessible information, like having information that people can really easily get access to, whether that covers different learning styles, that's available on their phone or maybe up on the wall in the clubhouse, in a hotel room, whatever that looks like. Actionable information. So stuff that you can take information and then make a change with, not just a 10-page report of lots and lots of numbers that doesn't really have an impact on how the game gets played. And then simplicity. Again, the less I'm able to say, maybe being a little hypocritical and talking a lot and having my own webinar today, but the less I'm able to say, the more to the point my message will be. I really don't subscribe to the train of thought of saying more will lead to more understanding. My experience of working with all these different athletes is the more I speak, the more my message gets diluted. So again, finding those trim tabs of analysis, those little things that are going to make massive differences, and then towing those forward into training interventions, into games. And then within that, active learning. So again, having players really have to lean in to try to maybe struggle to find the right answers, having things constantly shifting so that they actually have to learn how to adapt under changing situations. Spaced repetition. So just because we covered kickoff 3 weeks ago doesn't mean that we can't cover it again this week. So making sure that we're touching on things quite on the different areas of play quite consistently. And then again, deliberate practice, not necessarily having 10 kickoffs in a row as much as, okay, here's one kickoff and then we're gonna have a scrum after that. And we've got to get it right. One of the things that there is probably a little hesitation from coaches when I talk about this, because there's, when it comes to game realism, the training for it might not look great. There's going to be times when the ball hits the ground. There's going to be times when things don't go according to plan. And that's actually perfect because that's exactly what happens in a game. And simulating that in training is so key. It's so important. If we're a great example of this in a lot of club trainings, in a 15s environment, 90% of phases will go over the gain line, over the gain line, over the gain line. What happens in the training environment where you get 2 phases in a row that go backwards? And then your key kicker is pinned in that ruck and you're in your own 22. What then? Again, going back to, I think, Mike Tyson's quote of like, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Finding those ways, deliberate practice, finding those ways to, when things are really not quite going according to plan, now what do you do? Those are the ways that teams can really find ways to grow beyond what they know is safe, for sort of 10 scrums, 10 lineouts, 10 restarts. Final notes on that. What I've covered there is realistically about 20% of my impact with the people that I work with. And the reason I say that is because the 80% that really makes all of that 20% go is the fact I'm dealing with people. And it's a constant reminder for me to never forget that whoever I'm dealing with, that's a human with their own stories, their own way of receiving criticism or feedback or whatever it is. And so finding ways to connect with those people, finding ways to create an environment. There's a lot being written right now about psychological safety in like the Harvard Business Review and a number of other business publications. And creating environments like that, for me, have been so crucial in actually doing all the other stuff that I talked about. Working with people one-on-one, being able to have an environment where I can say something and have someone say, I actually think that you're completely out to lunch on that, is really, really key for me, because it is fundamental to our relationship. So the next time I can come back and say, continue to challenge, to have those same kind of interactions, whether it's players, coaches, support staff, administration. It's a key part of all of the technical stuff that I do. And the last thing is you got to have fun. And I don't know if this is going to come through. I really hope that it does. But now and then we just got to remember.
So the score will stay PG5 with Japan get the score.
I mean, we're playing a great game. We're so lucky to be able to do it. And if we can't celebrate that, I don't know what to do.
Calum, thanks for the video. So just so you know, I mean, the video, when it comes over, you going through your server onto other people's servers. It's not like downloading off YouTube. Unfortunately, it's pretty laggy. But if you could just walk us through what the video was and how it was fun for the guys.
Oh yeah, beg your pardon. Okay. We just got a clip of Jerry Tuai here, and I remember seeing him in Hong Kong making a kickoff call, and he he just had this wide open mouth, so we dubbed it with Celine Dion's "And I Will Always Love You." So got a pretty good response, and again, just that reminder that we're playing a game. We're lucky to be there, and can't take myself too seriously.
Outstanding, thanks. For those interested, the song was not actually by Celine Dion, so I'm going to give 5 points to the person who's able to write that in the question box, the actual artist of that song. But in the meantime, we have quite a bit of time to answer some questions, and I know we are mostly here to listen to Calum speak, obviously. However, I did want to share a quick story, and it goes back to Calum, what you were talking about with the restaurant only having 9 items. And so back in my younger years, when I was the groupie for a band, roadie, not groupie, the roadie for a buddy's band, we would go out onto these shows, and I would be the guy at the soundboard during the concert for them to let them know, hey, there's a guitar solo here or a drum solo there, and then they would adjust the audio. And everywhere you would go, the sound people would turn up that individual instrument. And then we get to this one place in Ottawa where if you make the show, if you make it to this one venue, it's kind of like you're really on your way up, right? And so we go to this venue, first song, first guitar solo, here it comes, and the sound guy pulls all of the audio dials down except for that one instrument. And so after the show, I said, hey, what was that all about? And he said, Nathan, music is really just sound to the brain, and sound is just information. And so when I turn one instrument up, I'm changing very little bits of information. Whereas if I turn everything else down, I'm drastically changing the information that goes to your brain. Therefore, you're probably going to really retain that one piece that we accentuated by turning everything else down, right? And it just made me think about, the how you were talking about removing things that weren't relevant, right? And similar in terms of how much we take in as information. This presentation is probably another great example, right? How much have you thrown out there? How much are people actually going to retain? What are the little bits that individuals are going to be able to take away? So really, really interesting stuff. I want to thank you for that. Calum, how about some questions, mate?
Yeah, so I don't have anything else to present, so please, by all means, I am open to whatever you'd like.
Okay, well, we've got a few here. So maybe can you walk us through some of your workflow? How much time do you spend live coding? How many outside sources maybe do you use? Opta being one. And if you're obviously very new to all of this, how would you recommend someone use some of that time that they have to start out?
Yeah, I mean, let's start. If somebody, excuse me, if somebody's new to analysis, the most important thing is to actually be able to get some sort of elevation on the game, and I mean physical elevation, so you have a good perspective of whatever's going on. Get a video camera on it and shoot a wide angle shot so that you can actually understand what's going on outside of the immediate ball movement within the game. That, if again, for a club or a university team that doesn't have anything else in place, do have that and get it up on like a private YouTube channel, Facebook, anything like that. That is going to do a massive amount from not having anything at all. If you're able to also like pick up some funding, I'm just going to open my phone here because I was talking with the guy who does some work with UVic yesterday, and so he's using a free app called, it's an iPad app called Video Tagger. And so having any sort of free analysis software, there's also some stuff that comes in. So Huddle's got stuff on offer. Longo Match has, I think, some relatively cheap options. Max Sport, lots of different companies out there are providing some pretty outstanding services for not a lot of budget. Having anything that lets you go in and annotate video is going to be massive in just quickly splicing together, for example, every scrum attack or every kickoff. That's sort of the low end of it. Sorry, not the low end, but that would be the starting point. In terms of my own personal workflow, it's going to depend if I'm in the sevens environment or 15s. In the sevens, we get all the analysts from all the different World Series teams sitting in one big room. We get 2 camera angles that we capture into our computer. And so those 2 camera angles are recorded, and I'm just sitting there with my keyboard hotkeyed up, meaning that I can sit and type as the game takes place, and that annotates the video with all these different events that I'm interested in as the game progresses. In a 15s environment, it might be a bit different. There'd be more camera angles. Often there's a second analyst who's network linked into my computer, so I can do a first run through the information, and then the second analyst can add information into what I've already included. All kinds of things like that. And the information, I'm being a little bit deliberately vague, but can be whatever is of importance to the coaches or the staff that you're working with. So it can be where the kickoffs are going, or it can be how teams are scoring, or it can be anything like that.
Awesome, great. I'm going to try and combine a few questions here to maybe use your knowledge in both 7s and 15s, but what are basically the key KPIs for both 7s and 15s that you would, like 3 or 4, and then would they be the same as at the community end of the game as at the high performance end of the game? And if not, Calum, what would they be at the community end of the game?
Yeah, so the really, really good question, and one that I'm still endeavoring to answer. For me to be able to have a recipe of, if we can hit 38% on this and 100% on this, we'll win every game. Like, that is the analyst's dream. I don't know what the KPIs are at the club level. If I look at performance analysis, there are sort of 2 main areas, and I alluded to them earlier. There's 2 main areas you can put your time into, your resources into. One is that game realism piece. So finding out what happens in games and tailoring your training to be more game realistic, as opposed to what most people will do, which is, well, we're going to train this way, and then we're going to try and drag that onto the field. And I find that actually understanding what happens in games and adapting training to that is going to see like massive, massive differences. So I don't know what the KPIs would be for the club game. If I was a club coach, if I was in that environment, what I would do is go back and get my last, if it was 15s, maybe get my last 3 to 5 games. If it was 7s, get anywhere from 10 to 15 games, and go through, and I would track a couple of things. I would track, I would look at when tries are scored, how are they scored? So are they scored from set piece? Are they scored from turnovers? I would look at how many phases it takes to score those. And then likewise, that would be for our team when we're scoring, and also when we're being scored on. Being able to take that and then replicate that in the training environment is going to have massive strides. In terms of KPIs for the national team, I'm going to be deliberately deceptive here as well, just because I know there'll be a few other analysts from other teams on this call. I was just texting back and forth with the Blitzbox analyst before this, and he said he was going to come join. So I think it's almost 1 a.m. in Cape Town. So goeiemôre, Ash. What I can say in the 7s game, catching kickoffs. So if the other team is kicking to me, just securing the kickoff is one of the biggest defensive plays we can make, because we're preventing a team, like I alluded to with the Fiji. Fiji is really good at kicking the ball off, stealing it back, scoring. So preventing a team from stealing that ball, that's a massive, massive asset to us. The actual KPIs for every team are going to be different. So with a Scotland, a Wales, who else would do it? A Canada is under Damien McGraw. We had a very possession-based game, so possession became a really important statistic for us. building phases. These are, that became kind of the bread and butter. But then with sevens, the nature of it is that there's lots of different correct ways to play. So it's kind of, you have to understand your own style of play before you understand your KPIs. And that's where the other, I was saying game realism is one side. The other side of performance analysis is actually understanding which factors lead to a win or a loss. That's a lot more difficult to work with. In 15s, I'm going to say there's a lot of similar things. Something people get really obsessive over, like a scrum retention, like how many scrums are we winning? To me, that's not that important unless you're a team like a Romania or a Georgia that live and score a lot of points off of getting penalties from scrums. So in order to understand what the right KPIs are, we have to understand what the game plan is. And it really gets into data sets and understanding of kind of a deeper level of analysis. So long answer, I apologize for not being able to answer it more directly, but hopefully that's of use.
Oh, I think that's great stuff. Just a couple of very technical questions for a few people. What are the programs that you use? Would they be similar to what you would use again at the community end of the game? And then for a high school program, if you were to film, what's the one spot you would want to film from?
For a high school, for any rugby, I either want to be on the halfway line really high up, or between the goalposts really high up. If I have to film from the ground, I'll film from between the goalposts. But the more vertical, the more perspective I can get on the game, the better. In terms of the software that we're using, so that the main two that we have, one is Sports Code. So that's what we use to capture video, to chop it up, to annotate it, and then that allows us to create data sets. So that's Sports Code is the workhorse, and then Game Plan is what we use to distribute footage to all of our players so that they can watch it on the 12-hour flight over to Hong Kong or something like that, or they can go home and then they'll get a notification saying training is ready. In terms of what I use, I think I would have covered this in what I said just a few minutes ago. Would I use this as if I was to go into a club environment? Again, absolutely nothing wrong with private YouTube channels, private Facebook groups, sending stuff out on WhatsApp in terms of just distributing footage. That's great. And then there's, again, SBG has a software called Focus. We have Angles is another software by a company called Fulcrum. We have Video Tagger, which is the iPad app. There's another software called MyVA, or My Video Analyst, that's available through App Store, I think. There's lots of different software that is available to annotate video. And I could make a recommendation I would make a recommendation, but not really having the depth of knowledge that I have with Sports Code. I don't want to point people in the wrong direction. And at the same time, whatever you choose, like just pick up a tool, get to know it really well, and that's going to take you a lot further than simply than not reviewing any footage, not having any access to annotated video.
Quite great. Interesting question here. How much do you look at trends in the future? So is there room for trying to see either where the game is going to go, or when you collect all of the information on where the game currently is with a lot of teams as well as your own team, do you use some of that information to try and be creative?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so again, this is a lot more apparent in sevens. Sevens is like a very, it's like fashionable how it's like, okay, tight jeans are in, okay, now baggy jeans are in, tight jeans are in. It's like, you can look, having been involved with the sevens for a long period of time, how different styles of play, like the pullout is probably the best example of this. The pullout used to get used all the time, I don't know what, 7-8 years ago, and it kind of fell out of fashion for a while, and now it's come back in. So things like this, like they are cyclical, and people are always looking for new ways to really get an edge over people, to get an edge over their opposition. in terms of do we look at where the game is going, yes and no. There's a tricky way to, it's a tricky way to answer that, partly because if we're in a position where we are reactive to what's happening in the external environment, we're kind of being led, like we're kind of getting dragged somewhere, as opposed to really going in with an intention and being assertive around, this is the style of rugby, this is the brand of rugby that we want to play, and then carrying that through an entire World Series or an entire World Cup campaign or something like that. So it is, I would sort of revert back to an 80-20 rule. It is important to understand what's going on out there, and at the same time, it is much more important to understand how we want to play, what our alignment is within our own team, and how much we are sticking to that, whether it's our training or in the actual execution of the game plan.
Outstanding. Can you talk about how you use analysis during training sessions? Is there a room for it to be effective right during the session? Is it always used post-session? And how much does the coach, have a say in what kind of things we're looking for during training?
Yes, lots of great questions out there. So ultimately, the coach is the one calling the shot. So if the coach, I can have like a butterfly that I want to chase. Hey, I'd really like to look at this thing. And if the coach is saying, my methodology for playing is this, these are the things I need to look at, then that becomes my highest priority. In terms of using video in training, currently with the setup that we have, where my in-training role is very much just filming training and then chopping the video post-training. Could we implement, live stats or anything like that? Absolutely. If we had access to if we had access to several other analysts, essentially we are limited by our number of workers. In terms of sort of live interventions, any time that we have the ability to assess what's going on as it's happening and then give some feedback, like that's back into that feedback loop around one of the themes that I was talking to, that's a great tool. And it mostly just comes down to resources.
Awesome. Really like this question. Someone's interested in hearing more about player-driven work and empowering them to present on topics. Can you maybe speak more to the process that's used with the national team, and what are maybe some tips and tricks to maybe apply those same principles to your club or even high school team?
Yeah, again, great question. My experience in teams of all levels is that you naturally got role players. There's always going to be, a guy that's going to be much more attack minded. There's always going to be that guy. So there's always going to be that athlete that really likes to go out and be physical. There's always going to be an athlete that's going to target breakdowns a little more, or somebody who likes to really have a nice clear, and likes to have a really abrasive carry. And just finding these things where an athlete has a natural attribute, and really leaning on the fact that you're already very strong at this particular aspect of the game. How do we take the knowledge that you already have and not rely on the coach to disperse that knowledge? If I was a particularly good ball runner and I was really great footwork and always able to win, to be dominant in my collisions, how do I make sure that I get empowered by the coach or by the other players to know that, hey, this guy lives for this one particular aspect of play, and if he's going to come to me, it's done with the intention to grow. So in terms of how we do it on the national team is we have our squad is split into different groups. At the end of the tournament, they will report back to either myself or normally the head coach around what they've seen in their specific aspect of play, and then that can drive the feedback for the rest of the group. The one thing I will say is that it really, kind of going back to that 80-20 thing that I talked about at the end of the presentation, where in order to have that mentality and that ability within your team, you have to have something set up where there is this constructive culture of Nathan, I can come to you and hey, I need to have a word with you. You're hitting too high and you're getting bounced too many times. And Nathan isn't going to take it personally because he's committed to the same thing that I'm committed to. So really kind of already operating that thing within an umbrella of shared value, shared commitment, like being able to take your ego out of it and create something that is of value to the coach, to the players, like to each teammate, having senior players lead younger players, and also younger players challenge senior players. Okay, we've always done something this way. Okay, we can also try it this new way. Does that cover it, Nathan?
I think so. I think you're being a bit presumptive about what I take personally or not there, Calum, but we're going to try and do a couple real quick ones here, mate, before I have to sign us off. That's the one. Do you focus more on attack or defense, or what's the balance there? And I'm assuming it probably depends.
If I was going to lightning quick it, I would say yes, it does depend. And again, going back to game realism, half of the game is attack, half of the game is defense. So spending, finding out what proportion of the game is spent in each area, and then spending an associated amount of time with that. It's all well and good to spend hours and hours on driving lineouts, but if you're in a club team where you have 3 driving lineouts a year, that's really not efficient allocation of resources. So finding out where to get that most leverage and most bang for your buck is massive.
Okay, great. Can you maybe speak to whether or not analysis is used for selection? Is that something other coaches should be focused on to help with, players at the club level, maybe wanting to get selected to go into the Pride program or some sort of Canada Academy or development program? Is there anything that they should be aware of there?
I think so. Analysis does play a factor in selection of for the men's sevens, so for whatever our next tournament is. Analysis will play a factor in that. And within that, the really important thing to understand is the limitations of analysis. So if I give a player a tackler rating, we have to understand the context of that thing. So it does play a slight role, but simply padding the numbers doesn't ensure that a player is going to get selected. The example I would use is, I would say our best defender that we have is not in our top 5 tacklers, and that's because he ends up playing as a sweeper and has to be exposed to these like open field, really challenging tackles. So is there an angle of analysis that goes into selection? Absolutely. And is there more to just the numbers that show up? 100%.
Awesome. Great. Calum, we're going to just do a quick little wrap up. But if you were to take yourself 10 years ago and point yourself to a couple of resources, do a couple come to mind real quick to help with people maybe looking for online or literature?
So there's a website called, I think it's called thevideoanalyst.com. It might be the performanceanalyst.com. Great starting point. And beyond that, again, I hate to be non-creative, but YouTube, Google, there's a lot of people out there writing some really interesting articles and coming up with some really interesting videos. Not to say that everyone is right or wrong, always coming at this with a critical eye and understanding of where they're coming from, what I can take from this, but not necessarily that I have to take everything as real.
Excellent. Calum, thank you once again. I think there was a lot of info there. We, of course, as always, did not get to everyone's question. However, we had about a dirty dozen who came up with the correct answer of Dolly Parton being the original author of the, I can't remember the name of the title of the song, but there you have it. So Dolly Parton, and then the cover by Whitney Houston. So thank you everyone for playing our game. Thank you also for listening in tonight. As we know, we are still, Rugby Canada still has the suspension of all rugby activities in person going on now indefinite, with the latest update, or the next update, sorry, to come no later than June 30th, although I would expect us to hear back sooner. So just keep your ears peeled for that. Additionally, this coming Thursday, we have David Butcher from Queen's University, who will be going over coaching the attacking breakdown. And then a little plug here for our provincial partners, Rugby Alberta, BC Rugby, and Rugby Nova Scotia will be having a discussion tomorrow looking at the linking of practice design and performance analysis with air and tackle. So that's at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. So check out online where you can find that information. Calum, once again, thank you very much. Any parting words for our guests?
I mean, thanks for taking the time to tune in. I'm, if anyone is at a loose end and really gets stuck with this stuff, please feel free to add me on LinkedIn, and I will endeavor to do my best to get back to you with whatever information is going to be of service.
Excellent. Thanks, mate. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, guys.